Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dry Eye Club Seeing Outcomes webinar. Yeah, before the event starts, I would like to acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and love the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for the country. Well, welcome for the first Dry Eye Club Seeing Outcomes webinar. My name is Maria Cabrera-Aguas. I am a research associate at the Safe Site Institute, and I will be your moderator today. We have presentations from Professor Stephanie Watson, Professor Fiona Stapleton, Dr. Himal Kandel, Dr. Ngozi Chidi-Egboka, and Ms. Narina Janian. Follow these presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. So please ask your questions on the Q&A box, which you can find below on your screen. And after the presentations and the Q&A sessions, we're going to send you a link for a feedback survey. This will help us to improve our webinar in the following years. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Stephanie Watson. She is the head of the Cornell Research Group at the Safe Site Institute and head of the Cornell Unit at the Sydney Eye Hospital. The chief investigator of the Safe Site Dry Eye Registry Project, chair of the Australian Vision Research and co-deputy director, Industry Innovator and Commercialization, Sydney Nano Institute. Welcome, Stephanie, to our webinar today.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'm going to talk about the Safe Site Dry Eye Registry, which is the part of the Fight Corneal Blindness project. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, just why are we here talking about registries? Well, clinical registries have been recognised as increasing importance in ophthalmology. So much so that the number of registries has significantly increased, as well as the subjects that they're covering. Now, why we need registries is because clinical trials, they give us sort of a very strict patient sample. And so there's things called inclusion and exclusion criteria. So when we're selecting patients for a clinical trial, we look and we want a very similar group of patients that are very much the same. Whereas when treatments go into the real world, they get given to a whole range of patients with a different set of, age, sex, and different morbidities and using other treatments. So to try to find out what was happening with treatments and outcomes in the real world, the Safe Site registries were set up by Professor Mark Gillies. And as part of this registry project, I set up the Fight Corneal Blindness project. The first registry that we had was for keratoconus, and we were concerned about whether patients and clinicians would actually be able to use this registry in everyday practice. And one of the first studies we did was a time and motion study that found that the registry had no impact on consultation time, and that clinician satisfaction with using the registry was very high. And that's because they didn't have to look through pages of manual notes to find and see what was happening with patients. They could access it all online through the registry system. And so subsequent to the keratoconus registry, I set up the Safe Site Dry Eye Registry, which was launched during COVID, not the best time, but we've managed to grow it to 25 clinicians from 21 sites in around 7 countries, and it's expanding as we speak. And why we did this is because dry eye remains a very common problem. Its prevalence ranges from around 5 to 50% worldwide. And despite the treatments available, many patients still have symptoms. We're seeing increasing dry eye across the globe, and some of this is due to changes in the environment and changes in habits such as screen time and air conditioning, but also the aging of the population, because dry eye is currently more common with increasing age. And so there's an unmet need really to find out, well, what is happening to dry eye in the real world in terms of natural history, but also dry eye treatments. The registry is a multinational registry that both optometrists and ophthalmologists can use. and it includes patient-reported outcome measures, and you'll be hearing more about this from Dr. Himal Kandel later in this session. We also collect key findings on the eye examination. We have little screen tools so we can see a visual representation of what that sign might look like. And this way we can grade the findings. And this is very useful for follow-up when patients come back to see if they're getting better or worse. One of the key signs in dry eye, which Professor Stapleton might talk about, is corneal staining. And this is when we put a fluorescein strip in the eye, a yellow dye, and have a look with a cobalt blue light. And in dry eye, there's many erosions or scratches on the surface. And we can grade this with the registry to see how the dry eye is going. We also collect a range of treatments, and there's many treatments for dry eye. And over time, patients may try a range of treatments and in different sets of combinations. It's important to kind of keep a track on which treatments have been used, and so we can select the ones that are most likely to work and have fewer side effects. Once all the data is entered into the registry for each patient, for each eye at each visit, we get quite a nice summary of their prior treatments, their pre-existing ocular conditions, the type of dry eye, and then key findings on the examination, and the patient-reported outcomes give us the symptoms. So all this is also helpful for clinicians, because once the data goes in, the registry itself can automatically generate reports, and these reports can summarize for a clinician how many patients they've treated and what the outcomes of a certain treatment is. And this enables what we call benchmarking, where clinicians can compare their results to all the other clinicians in the registry to see which treatments work and how their practice compares to others. So the key benefits of the registry, look, it's really easy to use. We can use it for tracking. All the data in it is anonymous. There's been quite a few publications that we're now working on from registry data. Clinicians can use benchmarking. We can get patient-reported outcomes, which you'll hear more about. And we have a whole system for training and support in terms of the IT. So it's really an easy-to-use tool. We're going to hear more about it in the up-and-coming presentations. And it's going to generate more research and knowledge on dry eye and its treatment. And we're hopeful that this data that will be collected will now enable us to know a bit more about the natural history of dry eye and also about the best treatments to use. For clinicians who are on the webinar, if they're interested in joining the registry and using it, it's free of charge. You can access the registry here online. Please contact us. And we have a large team behind us supporting the registry and a steering committee, and I'd just like to thank them here in this slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction of the dry eye registry. So please don't forget to ask your questions on the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your screen. So our next presenter is Essential Professor Fiona Stapleton from the School of Optometry and Vision Science from the UNSW. Welcome, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Maria, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of this information. As Maria said, I'm from the School of Optometry and Vision Science at UNSW, and I also pay my respects to the original owners of the land. It's the slide. So like all good researchers, when Stephanie and Ngozi asked me to give this presentation, I thought I'd use Dr. Google and find out what were the common questions asked by those with dry eye. What kind of things should we be addressing in this update? And I guess, so these were the top half a dozen questions that came up. How common is dry eye? What causes it? Does it get better? Does it get worse? Can it be cured? And are there new treatments? And where can we go to for help? So rather than just sending you off to Google, I thought I might present some recent updates and try and give some Australian context to some of those questions. So as Stephanie said, anywhere between 5 and 50% of individuals over 40 suffer with dry eye disease. And the most kind of common statistic talk about 1 in every 10 people being affected with severe symptoms in the over 40s age group. We don't have very much recent data in Australia, and most recently in 2023, dry eye has been included in a very big study, national study in Australia to look at 5,000 individuals over the age of 50 and a population over 40 of Indigenous individuals. So we're starting to get some data from that study, and I thought I might present some of those numbers. So this is mainly in data in the over 50s population, and some of these numbers did surprise me. So 1 in 4 individuals have been diagnosed with dry eye by a clinician. 1 in 5, not 1 in 10, have severe symptoms. 1 in 5 have both symptoms and signs of dry eye disease. And 1 in 4 are using lubricating drops between 1 and 10 times a day. And they're spending somewhere between $10 and $80 on average per month, not just on lubricants, but on all types of dry eye medication. So if we move on to thinking about what causes dry eye, we hear a lot about risk factors for disease, and these are things that modify the risk. They can either increase or decrease the likelihood of you having dry eye. And one way that we think about some of these factors is whether they're modifiable or not, whether we can intervene and change them. So these kind of things help us with understanding how we might help patients who have dry eye by attending to some of those modifiable risk factors. And the importance about risk factors is that they're studied in populations. So they're not just derived from people who have dry eye, but they're derived from studies that look at the comparison of people with dry eye and those without. We know there are 2 main types of dry eye, and this is important because the causes are likely to be different. We have both aqueous deficient disease, so not enough tears, and evaporative disease, where the tears evaporate and you have an unstable tear film. So what's the story about risk factors in the Australian context? And we've heard a lot about things like the pandemic-related effects on dry eye. So we know that mask use causes an increase in symptoms of discomfort and redness. But we've got some unique constraints in Australia around climate. We have 6 climate zones represented in Australia. We also have unusual climate in terms of things like bushfires and floods. So we have some unusual climate-related factors. Another piece that we observed in the pandemic, and this is worldwide, not just in Australia, is the increase in dry eye symptoms, at least with digital device use and with online schooling. So some of these things were purely short-term, but there are some of these things which have persisted, like our working from home and some online education type activities. So we need to be aware that some of those things will modify how often patients may report symptoms. So when we think about, this is a horribly busy slide and I really apologize for this, but what I wanted to show here was this difference between potentially modifiable risk factors at the bottom here and those that are non-modifiable. And the reason they're in columns here is our degree of certainty about these risk factors, how confident we are that they are real risk factors for dry eye, goes from right to left. So the ones on the left side are more likely to be strongly associated with dry eye in many studies. So there are some things that we kind of go, yes, we know about those. We've got older age, female sex. We know that the risk is higher in Southeast Asians compared with Caucasians. We know that people who've got meibomian gland dysfunction are more likely to have dry eye disease. We know if you use computers or use digital devices or you wear contact lenses. There's a big area of research at the moment looking at environmental factors, and these might be related to climate or climate change, but also things like how the external environment influences your internal environment. So that might be around allergens and pollen. It might be around chemicals in the environment. It might be vehicle exhaust fumes and so on. We know that cataract and refractive surgery are both associated with dry eye disease. And you can see here, we go down the list and you can see some other factors which are related both to systemic diseases and also kind of lifestyle, dietary and other factors. So this is a sort of overarching idea of the things that can contribute to dry eye disease and the things that we can intervene in and the things we really can't. So the other question was around the treatment of dry eye. And I know there's a question in the chat here, and I'm going to just park that for a moment. But a big question that comes up from patients is, does dry eye get better or can it be cured? And in terms of treatment in Australia, we tend to find that the treatments fall into these 6 groups. So there are treatments for aqueous deficiency or replacing the tears, and that might be things like tear conservation, lubricants. There might be treatments for evaporative disease, which particularly look at trying to improve the oil layer of the tear film. So diet or lifestyle modifications, as we've seen from those risk factors. We might also have those environmental modifications, which we know are probably having more effect on patient symptoms. And then we've got things like the anti-inflammatory treatments and those kind of more extreme, perhaps surgical interventions. So we can sort of divide those into different categories and sort of see where those sit. So I would say here that dry eye is a chronic disease. And if we look at people over a long term, I know the registry is going to give us some tremendous data about how people change over time when they're using their regular treatments. We also know that certain types of dry eye can get a little bit worse over time, and we understand that there are some factors which contribute to more severe disease outcomes. So by looking at those risk factors and by looking at those factors which are associated with a more severe disease, we can perhaps intervene and counsel our patients on how to try and improve their outcomes with treatment. So what should I expect in my treatment? And again, I've got some of those treatments that we've talked about sort of stacked up in this pyramid. So as a sufferer with dry eye, you can expect your practitioner will ask lots of questions about your history, not only how long you've had dry eye, and what treatments you're using, but a lot about those risk factors that we've talked about, a lot about systemic conditions which might influence dry eye and their medications, questions about prior surgery, what treatments have worked and what haven't, and how's your symptoms. You'll often get a symptoms questionnaire to try and assess the severity of those symptoms. Your practitioner will also try to manage other aspects of your eye or health condition. So that might be things like rosacea, it might be blepharitis, it might be getting rid of any allergic type complications you may have. It may involve treating Demodex, which we know can sort of confound both the diagnosis and the treatment. Based on some of those risk factors that we know about, there'll be consideration of things like diet, how much water you drink, whether you smoke, whether you drink alcohol, and those environmental factors. Are you particularly susceptible to windy conditions, for example? Those kind of things help us with understanding the treatment piece of the condition, but also in terms of how to mitigate the effect that dry eye has on your life. I mentioned that dry eye is a chronic condition, and the way we often think about this is in terms of sort of stepwise treatment. So both escalating the treatment when things are not improving, but also stepping down that pyramid when things are improving and are stable. But I think it's fair to say that sometimes flares associated with your dry eye disease are part of that journey. So the other piece is about, I guess, thinking about, is what you're experiencing normal for dry eye? Are you the only one who feels like that? And how are others managing? And I thought that it might be worth just flagging a couple of resources. There is a Facebook group, many of you may be associated with this already. Forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know. There is a Facebook group called Dry Eye Care, which is moderated by a practitioner called Lee Plowman. He's a dry eye sufferer, so he's really sort of up to speed with what patients experience, and there's a lot of discussion on this Facebook page, which can make people feel a little bit less isolated if they can see that other people are are experiencing similar types of symptoms. There's also a web resource which does talk about the sort of products that are available for the treatment of dry eye, but also there's quite a lot of information there for sufferers of dry eye. So those two resources may be useful if that's not something that you've experienced before and want to go take a look. So new treatments on the horizon. I guess there are always new treatments. And one of the things that I find in our dry eye clinic at UNSW is that my patients tend to know about these things before I do. So often things filter through us from, once very large scale clinical studies have been published. So we're sort of some way down that food chain. But there's a lot of treatments that are available that haven't necessarily been through that rigorous pathway for registration. But I thought I'd talk about this particular treatment just because I think it's quite exciting and it has a sort of Australian flavour to it. This is a treatment that both Stephanie and I were part of the clinical trials for. So this is it's an interesting product, but this is mainly directed at evaporative dry eye disease, which, as we know, is mostly caused by dysfunction of the oil glands in the upper and lower eyelid. And the thought is that this meibomian gland dysfunction, so-called meibomian gland dysfunction of those oil glands, is related both to the glands not producing the right kind of lipid, of oil, and also blockage of the glands, particularly with keratinization of the orifices and of the terminal ducts of those glands. So there's been some interest in keratolytic and lipogenetic. So that means getting rid of that hyperkeratinization and stimulating lipid production. And one of the pipeline treatments that we've been involved in is a product that contains selenium disulfide. And that may not mean very much, but it's a product that has been used in dandruff treatment. So if you've ever experienced Selsun Blue or any of those other dandruff treatments, this is the active agent. So it's been kind of quite well used in humans for a very long time. I don't suggest rubbing your eyelids with selenium disulfide in the form of Selsun Blue because it's a very high concentration and it'll sting like mad. But as a concept, because it has been used for dandruff treatment, this molecule reduces turnover and activity of those sort of skin-like cells and softens the protein that they produce. So theoretically, at least, it should help with that blockage of the glands by keratin. And it also accelerates oil production in skin cells, at least. It hasn't been proven in the cells in the eyelid gland, but they are a very similar cell type. So we were involved in a randomized controlled trial using a twice-weekly ointment used before bed and used for up to 6 months. And I'm just showing some graphs on the right. I'm trying to get my face out of the way as I talk to you about these. So this is the top graph is looking at symptoms. And what we're really looking at is these dark blue bars, which is a low concentration of this ointment. And this is really showing that by 6 weeks, we have about a third of the patients who were enrolled who had kind of moderate dry eye disease. They've ended up with no symptoms or below that cutoff for dry eye disease. And by about month 3, it's almost 50%. And it's a similar pattern for the signs for those oil glands. So again, you can see here that's actually a higher rate of change. And you can see this is a randomized controlled trial. There's a placebo control here as well. So certainly above the placebo by about week 6 in both signs and symptoms. So this is promising and interesting. And now this product is going into later phase clinical trials, probably in the US, and hopefully something like this will be registered. We don't know how this performs in patients who are using other treatments or who have more severe disease, because as Stephanie very clearly explained, these randomized controlled trials don't necessarily reflect real world, but they tell us about how well these products perform in very well controlled circumstances. So a little bit of a plug for what's happening in Australia. There are obviously other physical treatment devices and other therapeutic agents that are in trials. I'm not going to speak about those specifically, but I thought I might talk a little bit about something that's happening in Australia. And I'm really thrilled to be part of this group that has recently got together to collaborate on trying to improve outcomes in dry eye. So it has this collaboration has 3 aims. We want to understand how common the disease is and risk factors in Australia. And that's part of the Australian Eye and Ear Health Study. It's part of Stephanie's registry. We want to understand the cost and impact of disease. So that's around the quality of life piece, but it's also around the cost of disease, recognizing that many of these costs are actually out of pocket for the patient. So we do understand that this is an expensive disease, and part of the plan for this collaboration is to try and build evidence to see if we can get Medicare involved in part funding some of this diagnosis and treatment. And we're also looking at the quality of care and access to care, with a hope that this will help us identify those in the community that are more at risk of severe disease, help us support best evidence recommendations for diagnosis and management, improve the level of care, the equity of care, the affordability and access, and improve the level of care delivery. And one exciting thing for me is that this collaboration is being informed very strongly by the patient voice and experience. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much. I'm very thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you today, and very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fiona, for the great update on dry eye disease in Australia. So don't forget to ask questions on the Q&A box. We already have a few, so we're going to leave them to the end after the presentations. So let's move on, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Himal Kandel. He's a Kornhauser Research Fellow from Safe Sight Institute, University of Sydney. Welcome, Himal, to the webinar today.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Maria, and hello, everyone. I'm really happy to talk about patient-reported outcomes in the Safe Sight Dry Eye Registry today. I have been working in the patient-reported outcomes research for nearly 9 years now, about 5 years in the registry, and this is an area I'm really passionate about. In today's talk, I have divided into two parts. The first part, I'll be talking about what are patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, or questionnaires, and then in the second half, I'll be talking about how we use them in the Safe Sight Dry Eye Registry. The FDA defines patient-reported outcomes as any report of patient's health status that comes directly from the patient without interpretation by the clinician or the researcher. And the patient-reported outcomes include quality of life domains such as symptoms, physical, emotional, and social functions. And we collect patient-reported outcome data using the validated questionnaires, also known as PRO measures. Coming to the types of PRO measures, broadly, there are two types. Types of PRO measures used in dry eye. The example here is Ocular Surface Disease Index, the globally most frequently used dry eye questionnaire. It has questions or items specific to dry eye. The second type of PRO measures are the generic ones. For example, the patient health questionnaire, which has general content, not specific to dry eye, but these kind of questions are useful to evaluate mental health. For example, the example given here is used to evaluate the mental health impact of dry eye, and it has content like anxiety and depression. These kind of questions are not only relevant to dry eye, but to other populations as well. And coming to the importance of patient-reported outcomes, there are several importances and advantages of using them in the clinical practice. I will be discussing few of them. Patient-reported outcomes can enhance communication between patients and clinicians. They can often be the conversation starters and give more voice to the patients. Usually, when a patient goes to a doctor, often they go when they have like severe impact of dry eye or any other disease, and doctors only sees the tip of the iceberg, and patient-reported outcome measures enable the doctors or clinicians to understand a more comprehensive impact of the disease. Similarly, it is a great opportunity to involve patients in their own care. And often patients provide invaluable information about their condition. They know the best. Likewise, the regulatory bodies such as FDA, they recommend using PROs as a part of comprehensive outcome assessment. This is especially relevant in dry eye because signs and symptoms don't often correlate well, and then symptoms are measured using the PRO measures. This is also it is also important to use PROs to respect patient values and interests. For example, if X refractive surgery offers better visual outcomes than Y refractive surgery, but X causes more symptoms than such as dryness, patient may actually prefer Y. I mean, those with less dryness. They may not need crystal clear vision, but dry eye could be bothering them all the time. So it is PROs are the outcomes that are most valued by the patients and essential for increasing the value of our healthcare. But there are challenges in incorporating patient-reported outcomes in the clinical practice. When we say we want to measure patient-reported outcomes such as quality of life or satisfaction or happiness, these kind of latent traits, we do still need to follow the basic principle that we follow when measuring length or height or weight. But it does have more complex science, not as easy as measuring length, but so expertise is required. So this could be one of the challenges, and there is also, if they are not implemented well, then it also comes with respondent and clinician burden as well. And often PROs are used in the research settings, and the real-time use of PRO data is often not possible because it does involve some kind of calculations from using the questionnaire data. In the safe side dry registry, we have addressed most of these challenges, and we do the real-time patient-reported outcome measurement in routine clinical practice. Safe side dry registry, Stephanie has already described about it. So it is one of the safe side registries, one of the modules of the safe side registries. We have modules for various eye disease. And we have actually 35 users from 27 sites in Australia and Europe currently. This is the most current data. And SafeSite dry registry consists of data on demographics, clinical tests, medical history, and also includes has data on patient-reported outcomes. In patient-reported outcomes, we collect data using 3 questionnaires. The first one is OSDI, Ocular Surface Disease Index. This is the globally most common one. And it does have items on symptoms, activity limitations, or visual function, and the environmental trigger. Another questionnaire we use in the registry is OCI, or Ocular Comfort Index. This is a more recently developed questionnaire, less frequently used, but yes, there is some evidence which shows that it works actually better than OSDI, but to get the solid conclusion, we will be able to do that when the data grows in the registry. The third questionnaire we use in the registry is the mental health questionnaire, patient health questionnaire, and then we also have questions on screen time and medication compliance. So in the SafeSite Dry registry, usually patients complete the questionnaires in the clinic or waiting room. They can complete the questionnaire on paper or on iPad. And then as soon as they complete the questionnaire and it goes to the registry, the scores are automatically calculated. So clinicians don't have to do it manually. The clinicians can immediately see the scores, and they can compare with the previous clinical visits. Here is a screenshot of one of the data from one of the patients in 2 different visits. And by looking at this, clinician can immediately tell like how the patient is doing in these 3 measures. Pro data is also really useful to solve important research questions. This is an example of a research that we conducted using the SafeSite dry eye registry data. We looked at the impact of dry eye disease on quality of life, and I'm not going to going in details of this study in the interest of time, but what we did in this study is that we identified the factors that are associated with the decreased quality of life in dry eye patients. And we also found that there is a discordance between signs and symptoms. So for a clinician, it's really important to manage signs as well as symptoms, address both signs and symptoms, not just signs. So again, as Stephanie and Fiona mentioned in their talks, there are clinical trials, but clinical trials are often conducted in control settings, and they have strict eligibility criteria. So doctors are in the real world may not be very confident to apply those findings in their real world, but data from the real world SafeSite dry eye registry will make the doctors more confident about applying these findings in their clinical practice. So what's new on PROS in the SafeSite dry eye registry? We now have this practice, or doctors can send a link to the patient so that the patients can complete the questionnaire in their own device remotely. So this will this is a new feature we have in the registry, and it will increase the convenience for both patients and doctors. And we are also working on the new graphical displays, which will also be very useful for the clinicians as well as patients to see the journey in their patient-reported outcomes. So here is a link to, if you want to know, if you're interested to know more about the registry, there's a link here or a QR code. And if your doctor or if your optometrist is not has not joined the registry, please talk to them. And this is free of charge to the doctors to use the registry, so that they will be able to track your disease or treatment journey. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Himal, for introducing us to the patient-reported outcome measures in dry eye. Don't forget to ask your questions on the Q&A box. We have quite a few now, and we have answered some as well. So next move on, and let's welcome Dr. Ngozi Chidi-Egboka. She's a research associate from the SafeSite Institute, and she works in the dry eye registry. Welcome, Ngozi.
Thank you, Maria. So following up from previous speakers, I'll be talking about the benefits of dry registry from the patient perspective. It has a lot of benefits, including recording of patient treatment in real time and generating of outcome reports for individual patient treatment, and of course, leading to being able to understand the improvement in the eye health of patients suffering from dry eye disease over time. The diagnosis and management of dry eye disease involves two key components, and those are symptoms and clinical signs, as you have heard over and over from the previous speakers. And these factors could be triggered by, these symptoms and clinical signs could be triggered by factors such as the environment, the use of contact lens for prescription correction for vision or for cosmetic use, and also digital device use can trigger symptoms and clinical signs. The amount of time you spend on the screen, and blinking, how much do you blink when you go through normal activities of daily living or when you're using your digital devices? Do you observe the 20-20 rules? That is taking time every 20 minutes to look at something 20 feet away for 20 seconds and then get back to your digital device use. And for example, there are so many symptoms and signs of dry eye disease, as have been highlighted by previous speakers, and often these do not always correlate. So for example, we conducted a study in school-age children where we examined symptoms and signs of dry eye disease when children were exposed to smartphone gaming for 1 hour. And we found interesting results. Dry eye symptoms increased significantly by over 3 times within 1 hour of smartphone use, and the frequency of eye blink reduced significantly by over 1/3, starting from the first minute of gaming and all through the 1 hour of smartphone gaming. However, interesting result is that the clinical signs were not significantly impacted. And so that is where the challenge with diagnosis and management of dry eye disease for patients comes in. Several studies have tried to investigate this in the clinical studies and in the trials, like has been mentioned before, but they've been able to come up with conflicting results, and the natural history of dry eye disease is not well understood. that is where the Safe Side Dry Eye Registry comes in as a great way to track the real world clinical data of patient symptoms and signs, and then trying to understand over a longer term what the natural history of dry eye disease could be. And that gives room for comparison among different population demographics, risk factors, and treatment options available. So the Dry Eye Registry is a very user-friendly platform for patients as well. Like Dr. Kandel mentioned, the patient-reported outcome is a very important factor in the management of dry eye disease. So patients can have access to these patient-reported outcome measures in the form of questionnaires through the link that will be provided by their clinician. And this gives significant detailed reports about the dates where the patient has completed these questionnaires. And these questionnaires are also available in multiple languages, which makes it user-friendly for non-English native speakers. And the Dry Eye Registry, it's very important to patients because it helps patients to understand the comparison of the outcome of their treatment journey over time in comparison to other peers, other individuals suffering from dry eye disease. It is also helpful for patients to quickly see a visual interactive summary of their treatment journey, understanding what is going on at each point in time. As we can see here, by year and by month, you could see what's going on at each point in time. And then the patient, it makes it also easy for a patient to be referred between optometrists and ophthalmologists who are all together contributing data to this Safe Side Dry Eye Registry. So in summary, as a kind of capping up all what you heard this evening about Dry Eye Registry, Safe Side Dry Eye Registry provides real-world, high-quality data on patients, which gives us good insight into patient needs and how much well they tolerate the available treatment in the market. And also, it helps to be able to track the correct timing and the treatment options that brings out the best outcome report for each individual patient. And this goes a long way to help the clinicians to make informed decisions about treatment options for patients. It helps the clinicians to understand, it helps the patient to understand when they receive education about their dry eye and what's going on, and also helps to track or monitor the compliance with treatment. So the amount of data, the real world data provided by the Dry Eye Registry is a great way to bring out transparent, high quality data and of the quantity of care that patients receive from all over the world in the treatment, in the management of dry eye disease. And of course, it helps to bring out or inform industries and regulatory bodies of this treatment effectiveness and safety when we are managing dry eye patients with all the available treatment options. And we hope that Safe Side Dry Eye Registry on the long term would help to be able to understand the natural history of dry eye disease, improve outcome for each individual patient, and solve all the challenges, most of the challenges that we've had in the clinical studies around dry eye disease and management and improving outcome for patients. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ngozi, for telling us the patient's perspective regarding dry eye disease. And finally, let me introduce Ms. Narina Janian. She works in the advancement portfolio at the University of Sydney. Welcome, Narina.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this webinar. As Maria mentioned, my role is to support people who want to give to the university's research and education initiatives, and namely the Safe Side Institute. So in Australia this year, where researchers spend about 50% of their time applying for grants, and some of these grants have a success rate of 7 to 13%, which is extremely low. Our researchers need these successful grants and they're critical to their academic careers. With the dwindling government support, we're seeing a brain drain in Australia, where we're losing talented researchers to overseas opportunities. And they're also accepting defeat and changing careers. So this loss of a talent pool is a significant impediment to our research processes. This is where philanthropy comes in, and it's vital. Secure long-term sources of philanthropic funding can ensure that we retain these amazing researchers, and the researchers can actually shape their research agenda based on the greatest need, rather than what the government has available for funding. And also the next generation of scientists can be supported through their early careers and eventually lead in their fields. So here's my details right here on the screen. If you are interested in learning more about how you could support our research, please reach out to me. I also have a QR code that's present here on the screen if you'd like to make a donation directly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Narina, for giving us the information on how we can contribute to the research at the University of Sydney. So I have posted the link for the feedback survey in the chat box on the bottom of your screen. So we would appreciate your feedback on how we can improve the webinar for next year and what topics we can treat next year. So here on the slide, we have information of all our social media outlets. We have an account on Twitter, on Facebook, also the YouTube channel of the Safe Side Institute. We also have a podcast. It's called Sydney Eye Podcast, where we have talked about the dry eye registry, among other cornea research topics, and also a QR code where you can sign up for newsletters and news from the Safe Side Institute. So we have I invite all the speakers again on your screens, and then we have some questions here that you have posted on the Q&A box. We still have around 10 minutes to answer some. So for Himal, I suppose this is for Himal. It says, apologies if this has already been answered, but has any of the PROM data found links between mental health and dry eye disease? I appreciate chronic diseases typically equate to lower mood, greater anxiety, and less optimism.
Yeah, this is really interesting question. Thank you for the question. We have done a preliminary analysis using the Safe Side Dry Eye Registry and found that it is dry eye disease is actually associated with higher anxiety and higher depression. We will do the more in-depth analysis as the dry registry data grows. But it's also important to note that the analysis we did was is at a population level, like generally it is associated. But if you look at the dry eye patients, like some patients, they have severe dry eye and are doing really well in terms of mental health, whereas other patients, they may have just like mild dry eye and are severely impacted in terms of mental health. It's really important to consider individual status as well. But if you talk about the population, at the population level, there is association between dry eye and the dry eye severity and mental health.
If I could also add to that, the other thing to remember is that some antidepressant medications can also exacerbate dry eye. So it is an important risk factor to consider, and there's different types of antidepressants that can have more or less an effect.
Thank you both for the input. So another question is blepharitis curable? So maybe Fiona or Stephanie can give us any advice.
I think that blepharitis is generally a kind of chronic condition. I think it can be managed. I'm not sure it can be completely cured. It can be managed to a point where you're no longer symptomatic But I do think it's one of those conditions that needs to be addressed when you've got dry eye, because it may mean that you've got overgrowth of bacteria on the eyelid margins. It's kind of adding to the whole picture. So it is one of those things that it's important to get on top of. But I would say managed rather than cured. I don't know, Stephanie, you might have a different view.
Look, I agree with what you're saying there about the different features, because I mean, I always say to patients, look, blepharitis is a bit like saying sore leg, because bleph means lid and itis is problem. So there's a whole range of things that actually can be wrong with the lid in blepharitis. And so it's really sort of finding out what the specific signs are and targeting the treatment towards that. You can have the posterior bit of the lid affected, or the front, the bit with crusting and bacteria. So there's different solutions needed for different types.
Thank you for that. And I think this is for Himal. Himal, how long does it take to complete the questionnaire that you were talking?
Yeah, I think this is again interesting question, because usually clinicians, they often think that it takes a long time, and even patients, like when they see a questionnaire, it might take a long time. But what we have found is it takes less than a minute for a questionnaire to complete. That is because the developers have already taken into account so many things, like they use the consistent wording, simple wording, and then they use the same response option so that patients don't have to read response option every time they go to next questions and this kind of things. And simple is the better one. So in our registry studies also, we have found that less than 2 minutes patient can complete all 3 questionnaires we have in the registry.
Okay, great. I think for Ngozi, so what symptoms should indicate that a patient needs to seek help for, I don't know, either ophthalmology or optometrist? What would you recommend, Ngozi?
That's a very good question. So dry disease is multifactorial, so you can't really point a particular symptom. So there are very different ways patient can express or feel the symptoms. Sometimes they might not really be able to describe it. So I would suggest any minimal symptom or discomfort that you feel in your eye that is outside of norm is a good thing to seek a clinician attention over that. That way you could be properly tested or looked at, and then of course assessed with the questionnaires, specific questionnaires that we have, that will be able to bring out some of these key components of symptoms of dry eye disease that we have, such as feeling of gritty sensation, or kind of feeling of watery eye, or feeling of pain or soreness, or burning sensation. So they are multifactorial, but any little one that's other than normal, it's good to seek a clinician's attention over it.
Okay, great, Ngozi, for that advice, because sometimes I think the patients don't know where to seek help first, whether the optometrist, the ophthalmologist, the GP, so much information out there. For Stephanie, how can a patient know if their ophthalmologist participates in the registry?
Yes, on the SafeSight Registry's website, there is a list of clinicians that are currently contributing. The patient can also ask the clinician. I mean, if they're being asked to fill out the questionnaires, hopefully that's a sign that they're using the registry, particularly if that questionnaire is linked directly to the registry, because it can be directly, information can be directly inputted into the registry if you do it on an iPad, computer, or even via mobile phone. And you can read our publications. Often we have the participants listed on the publications as well.
Okay. I think we have a final question. Are there any patient support groups for dry eye disease?
Maybe I can take that one.
Yeah.
So there are quite a lot internationally. So Dry Eye Zone internationally, but the one in Australia that I've come across is the Dry Eye Care, the Facebook group. and the dry eye directory, which has a lot of information about dry eye disease. But if you want to sort of communicate with other sufferers, then the Facebook page is probably the best approach. I'll put the Facebook link in the chat so that you've got that as well. But that's not moderated by any of us here. That's moderated by an optometrist called Lee Plowman, who's super helpful. So I'll put that in the main chat so that you've got that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Fiona. Well, I think we have answered all the questions. So now thank you all for the audience for attending tonight on our first Dry Eye Club webinar. So I just want to remind all the attendees that you're gonna get an email with the recording of the webinar. Also, the webinar will be uploaded in the SafeSight Institute YouTube channel. And then in this email, you will also receive the link for this feedback survey. So we really appreciate your feedback on this webinar, so we can take into account your feedback for next year, and then we know what we can improve. So, well, thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight. Thank you all the presenters, for Fiona for coming as well, and Narina for giving us information about how to contribute to research at the University of Sydney. And then, well, thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.